Aloha nui and welcome everyone. This is Uahikea Maile. I previously was on the Red Nation podcast with Nick Estes talking about how Hawaiian pizza is racist and the imperial project in Hawaii by the US occupying forces. Speaking to Nick also about the ways in which people come to Hawaii in good ways and in bad ways. And I think it's important to remind everyone that we're in a pandemic. It's global, a global health crisis. Stay home. Don't travel to Hawaii. We don't need more tourists showing up on our shores, spreading COVID. I'm thinking about you, Canadian tourists, a few of which who recently spread COVID in Hawaii. And I want to say that as someone speaking, as a Kanaka Maoli speaking from Takaranto or Toronto in so-called Canada, I'm choosing to not fly home to my Kulaiwi, my homeland. So maybe take a hint. Don't go. Stay home. With that being said, welcome everybody. I'm super, super excited to be hosting for the first time for the Red Nation podcast. Grateful for my comrades with the Red Nation, Nick Estes, Melanie Yazzie, and the rest of the folks holding it down, not just in Albuquerque, New Mexico, but all over the world. I am delighted beyond belief to be joined by my dear Ho'aloha, Ho'apili, Shelley Muneoka. Shelley is a freedom fighter in her own right, a po'ealoha aina, a mana wahine. Shelley has been behind the scenes and on the front lines of so many land struggles in Hawaii, not just as a Kanaka Maoli, but as a researcher, as a community organizer, and as a strong and fierce voice in the nonprofit organization Kahea, a environmental Hawaiian alliance, which has also been at the forefront of many battles, specifically in current times against the 30-meter telescope project, which we'll be talking about. But I want to intro Shelley just really quickly with a story about how we first met. Shelley and I first met at Kamehameha Schools, Kapa Lama campus. In 2002, I was taking a summer school course, a writing course with Kumu Chun, actually, in order to get to go to Kamehameha, actually, because my writing was very poor at the time. And so I had to take the summer school class with a cohort of other folks. Shout out to everybody else, my hoa in that class. And my dad, being the father he is, he dropped me off at the crack of dawn. And I just so happened to be taking this class, not at Paki, in the lower campus, but at Konia, in the upper campus. It was a misty, foggy morning at Konia, and first time walking those halls. I saw no one in sight except for a group of 3 folks who happened to be incoming seniors. And one of them was Shelley. And I believe at the time, Peanut, as she introduced herself to me, came up to me, the lonely freshman, incoming freshman, mind you, and introduced herself, said hello, invited me to come hang out with some other folks. And the story ends with me proclaiming that Shelley Muneoka was my very first friend at Kamehameha Schools. That's my side of the story. What's your side of the story, Shelley?
Well, thank you first of all for that a very illustrious introduction and also the amazing public service announcement at the top of the hour. So important right now. Not enough of that messaging going out from the state for sure. Um, in terms of that first morning, that first day we became friends, thank you for painting that scene. I felt like I was right back there. Um, if I can say, like, you just looked a little bit out of place, and I was like, this poor kid. Like, I was just, I don't know. It was how I was back then. I guess I'm still that way. Try and reach out to folks if they're just looking a little bit like they could use someone to talk to. And yeah, I think I maybe felt a little bit protective is too strong of a word, but just like you looked very young, and I was just wanted to, you know, make sure that you didn't have to cruise there by yourself. It was like so early and you're all alone and it was cold and, bring a little warmth to the morning.
Do you remember who else was hanging with us? I want to say it was Travis Young and one other person, because Travis Young went to Pacific University for undergrad with me. There was one other person who hung out with us. I want to say he was a basketball player.
I don't know, dude, but it's so funny that you're bringing this up because I think I was doing like new student orientations or something that summer. Maybe was why I was there so early. I have no idea. I
Mm.
can't remember. But now that you're saying it's the summertime, that it rings a bell. But man, Travis Young, haven't heard that name in 1,000 years. You
It's
should
so
ask
wonderful
Travis.
to,
He might know the
yeah,
other person.
right. It's so nice to kind of reminisce about those times. I mean, it's also bizarre that they were 20 years
Ooh,
ago
don't
and
say it.
uh, 18, okay? Actually
That's
18 years
wild.
ago. But, like thinking about what it was like to be in high school at Kamehameha in the very early, 2000s, what that was like versus what it's like now. I mean, I don't even
True.
really know what it's like at this institution that, for folks that don't know, is an institution that was founded through the will and trust of one of the last ali'i of the Hawaiian kingdom, Bernice Pauahi Bishop. And the school has an admissions policy that has made it exclusive for Native Hawaiian children to attend this institution, although it's been attacked left and right over the years by um, Haole or white settler folks in particular that have claimed the admissions policy is racist. And we know that to be a very reverse racist argument. But the fact of the matter is, it's a highly contested educational institution. And
Mm.
even with that being said, and we could talk more about that perhaps, it is a place where Kanaka Maoli learn about themselves and learn about how to relate to one another and build relationships. And whether it's Travis Young or other folks like Ho'okahi Kanuha, who was I want to say he was a grade or two below me, and I always knew who he was. He was kind of kolohe in my mind, and here he is now as a leading force amongst Kanaka Maoli, not just stopping a project like the 30-meter telescope, but also revitalizing and leading a resurgence in Olelo Hawaii, or the Hawaiian language. I also thinking about Havane Rios, who was my classmate, another strong, fierce mana wahine that has stood on the front lines for many times against the 30-meter telescope. But those were the relationships that we made. And so it's so lovely that after all this time, since 2002, we've come back to one another, Shelley, and not only because of TMT, but because of our relationships that we built
It's
before
it's
that.
true, and I'm grateful. There's not a whole bunch of folks from that era of my life that I see in this kind of work now. Like, our classes are pretty diverse, I would say, in terms of like political view or just career path and stuff like that. And it means a lot actually to have like old friendships and people who know you as a person first,
Yeah.
before you come to the work is pretty pretty awesome. And I always appreciate love when you're home and we get to catch up and stuff. And yeah, so thanks for starting it this way. This was a nice trip down memory lane.
Yeah. 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 And again, mahalo nui for being with us uh, virtually, sonically, but in spirit, we're together in Pili, and one day when it's safe, we can hang out with a bottle of wine or beers and kuka kuka. It will happen.
Yes.
So all you possible tourists thinking about going to Hawaii, cut it out.
Cut it out.
So Shelley and I can hang out.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm super curious about your time after Kamehameha schools. And we've talked about it a little bit just in the past, the two of us. But, I think a lot of folks from Kamehameha, but also elsewhere, leave Hawaii to go to school, not to get away from Hawaii necessarily, but to, as Hawaiian historian David Chang writes, experience, observe, and learn from new relationships beyond Hawaii with a grounding in Hawaii itself. And so, I moved away from Hawaii in 2006 after graduating from Kamehameha to go to Pacific University, as I already mentioned, which is in Forest Grove, Oregon. Shout out to the folks who are from Hawaii and Forest Grove right now, battling out COVID away from home if you're there. And I know that you also, after graduating, went to Evansville. Can you talk a little bit about why Evansville, Indiana?
It was a weird
Why the
choice.
University of Evansville?
It's a good question, and it was an odd choice. And it's super funny that you're asking me this because someone just asked me this yesterday, in fact. So I've been thinking about it. But, the reason why I went to Evansville, well, I'll say firstly that I distinctly wanted to go to a place that didn't have a lot of people from Hawaii. And I think on some deep level, I knew that I wasn't likely to live away from home too many times in my life. And so I wanted to go to a place that was different. And I've heard other people be like, oh man, after I lived away, like, oh, I really appreciated home. All these, I really appreciated home before I left. Like, I loved Hawaii. But I was going specifically to get like a diversity of experience. And just kind of as like a programmatic reason, I wanted to go there because they have an undergraduate program in music therapy. And then, but after I got there, I, because I was a kid and didn't really do my research, it really was almost like a double major in music performance and psychology. And there's only like a few classes that were like actually integrated as music therapy courses. And so I actually didn't end up going in that path, but I did fulfill my first vision of going someplace that did not have a lot of Hawaiians or things from home.
What was the Midwest like for you?
I'll say that in many ways, it was really helpful in forming a Hawaiian identity because all the interactions were maybe the first time somebody interacted with somebody from Hawaii. And I already had, somewhat of a political independence kind of consciousness from Keanu Sai. I was going to these classes with my dad, like night school community classes when I was in high school still yet. And I heard Keanu Sai give his speech and, so anyway, I had a little bit of consciousness around that. And to be in Southern Indiana and to be able to define for myself, like, to push that Hawaii be included in like international student events and to, try and push that narrative forward. I mean, there were people there who didn't know, quote unquote, know that Hawaii was the 50th state. And I was like, great, I don't need to like undo that thinking. Let's start right there. Which is really cool. And then also it helped me learn about how different culturally and socially Hawaii has maintained, like for all the ways that we're Americanized, that there were things that we had held on to, and that was very apparent in interactions with people from, Japan, Korea, Nepal, Nigeria, like Philippines, all over the world, and just feeling the kind of instant recognizableness in those interactions, as opposed to like students that were from the Midwest, where it felt like a foreign student exchange. It really felt like, so that was interesting. I wasn't really expecting that.
So when you say that while you were in school there in Evansville in southern Indiana, there was a like engagement with other folks there where, some people perhaps didn't even think about how Hawaii is the quote unquote 50th state of the Union of the United States. And that afforded you an ability to talk or at least engage that misrecognition as accurate for considering actual international legal precedents for Hawaii's status. Can you talk a little bit about what that means and what that means to make sense of away from home?
I mean, it was honestly, it was exciting for me because when you're in Hawaii, it can feel crushing to like speak against that narrative, because everywhere you look, the messaging of the 50th state, that we're in America, all those narratives. But when you're in southern Indiana, there isn't any of that, and you can just, you know, live in your own truth and in your own definition. Like it was liberating in an odd way. Like I remember where I was in a conversation and somebody had said something like, in I don't know, do I need a passport to go to Hawaii, or something about, Hawaii being its own country. And then somebody else in the conversation trying to jump in because they felt embarrassed, like, no, 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 like Hawaii is a part of America. And I was like, actually, it just made this like nice little opening for conversation. And it was cool. I actually met, maybe in my time there, like two people. And one of them was a history professor who really did know like accurate history about Hawaii. And that was like incredible to me. And it was nice to be recognized in that way, and also just to have conversations with people from other countries who had been impacted by American imperialism or colonialism, even if not by America, but has some colonial history, to be able to not have to have such a contentious conversation about the basic facts of your history,
Right.
but in having an instant recognition and then being able to kind of compare or just talk about what was going on in our countries like around the same time, and maybe some discussion around like if those historical events may be related to each other in some way.
Right.
That was really cool. And then also like having a consciousness that for some of my other friends, maybe like from South America or like other parts of the world, that they're in a different moment in their like colonial history, and that their like presence at a college in the US, the inequity in their countries, like that they're in the US because they're of a certain like social status, or just what their family had to do to like get them out. Basically, it was just interesting to just learn about the lived experiences of people, and the way like these big words like colonialism and imperialism like plays out in actual people's lives.
Right. So fascinating. I mean, really, when Kanaka leave Hawaii and leave, in the kind of analysis and verbiage of Keanu Sai, as you mentioned earlier, leave that jurisdiction of the Hawaiian kingdom. we are immediately impelled into international relations, and forms of diplomacy and relationship building, whether it's in our times as students at universities or in trips abroad. Like, there have been a resurgence of young Kanaka Maoli leaders at the University of Hawaii with wonderful programming from faculty there to follow in the footsteps of our ali'i and ancestors that did travel wide and far, building economic relationships, political relationships, just social relationships. And this is something that we've always practiced, not just in Europe or not just in the Americas, but in Oceania, first and foremost. And so I think it's so important for folks for Kanaka to remember that this is a form of Hawaiian internationalism. When you're in southern Indiana, or when you're in Forest Grove, Oregon, or like me in Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Mississauga territory, these are international relationships. So important.
Yeah, how has
Because
that been for you? I mean, I know you've lived like all over like the place abroad, but I'm just curious like how what that experience has been like for you like right now, particularly because your work has a indigenous focus. Like, when I was in Indiana, I was a kid, like, there weren't deep questions about like indigeneity and identity. It was just, just yeah, I'm just curious, what is that like?
ooh, it is a life,
Yeah.
that's for sure. You know, living in Toronto now for about a year and a half, going on 2 years, being a assistant professor at the University of Toronto, St. George campus, there's been a lot of relative economic privilege and socioeconomic kind of forms of advantage that I've had and been able to use that I didn't have when I was in former locations. Like, previously, I was in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and before that, Portland, Oregon, Forest Grove, Oregon. So my experience in Toronto has certainly been colored differently because of the position I'm in at the university. And, it really has impelled me to think about that kind of experience of being off island and away from home, being Kanaka Hawaii, being from the Moana Nui Akea, but in Canada,
Hmm.
living in two different settler states is cacophonous and sort of loud and chaotic because of their regulations and forms of bureaucracy, which are similar and different.
Hmm.
And I have to negotiate what it means to carry a US passport
Mm.
in Canada in ways that I've never had to do in Oregon
Hmm.
or New Mexico or even Hawaii.
Hmm.
And so that's been super interesting. When I
Mm.
first moved to Toronto, thinking about relying on my US passport to
Mm.
just demonstrate who I was, why I was here,
Hmm.
and now, getting a work permit, for instance, that's tethered to my employment at the university.
Hmm.
Um, so that form of kind of international difference in regulation has been always on my mind since
Mm.
moving here. But I will say, beyond the kind of relationship with nation states and their forms of law, and citizenship, things like that, it's been amazing to work with First Nations, Inuit, Métis people in what is only now fairly recently called Canada, and will one day no longer be Canada, just as it wasn't Canada before Confederacy,
Hmm.
um, in the 19th century, which was not too long ago.
Mm.
And there is a really interesting energy in Toronto specifically, but around Canada with Indigenous activism, the way that folks, organizers on the ground, not to romanticize organizing and activism here, but there's a really strong push for intersectional forms of organizing that cross over with different kinds of organizing against extractivism in Latin America, for instance, or activism against police violence against Black people and Indigenous Black people in Canada. And so that's been really wonderful to get involved in as I can, and also just to think about kind of my role as a Kanaka Maoli professor at the University of Toronto, and subsequently to think about what I can do to labor in this process, to help in whatever way I can our Maoli cousins, and when I have time, to try to stop projects that Canada's involved in Hawaii. So yeah, there's always that sort of return, I guess, to Hawaii, even from Toronto. And to turn it back towards Evansville, did you, after finishing up in Indiana, did you start immediately working for Kahea? What was that kind of historical evolution like, and like what was that return like for you?
No, dude, not at all. So I finished my undergrad a little bit early, like a semester early. I actually was like scared I wasn't gonna graduate and went in to find out. They're like, you can graduate this semester. I was like, what? Yes. And so I went home a little bit early, and I had a really clear vision because I wanted to go into social work, specifically like grief counseling. So it's called bereavement social work. And I knew that I wanted to work in Hawaiian community. And so I know that there's like some practical aspect to a master's in social work. So I knew I wanted to do my practicum at home in Hawaii. So I came home right away, and I had a semester off before grad school started and stuff. So yeah, I didn't start at Kahea until after I finished grad school. And it was actually because of a protest that I got involved with that actually problematized my plans to become a grief counselor at a hospice. They were upset with my political activism, and so
oh wow,
yeah, so it sent me on a different path. And Kahea, it was actually just through like social connections. They were looking for an outreach coordinator, and somehow my name had got to them. And I remember when I went in for the interview, and they were like, we know about your activism, like what was problematic for my other employer. And they were just like, and we love it, like, please. And I was like, this is amazing. I don't have to like hide or like keep separate these two parts of my life.
right.
And it was interesting because my training was in how to cope with loss, which very much actually served me and serves me in like social justice work and like wanting to work with Hawaiians. Some of it is around death loss, but it's also like cultural loss and being disconnected from land and displacement, all those kinds of things. So in the end, it all came full circle.
So you get hired eventually at Kahea, the Hawaiian Environmental Alliance. Am I getting that right? Hawaiian Environmental Alliance?
Yep, that's right. That's right.
And so you're doing community outreach. What did that entail when you first started, and how did you find that experience then, and sort of the experience that you're in now with, let's say, COVID and having kind of responsibility to engage the community, but in a time of global health crisis?
Yeah, it was, I mean, so back then when I was doing that work, the way I would kind of explain to people what I did was to like translate um processes. So like different administrative and legal processes, and it's like basically it's not like I knew any of that stuff either. We had a staff attorney and community experts that knew those things, that would explain them to me with all of their jargony terms, and I could, ask all my questions and translate that so that it was more like less intimidating and just easier to understand basically. And we would go to communities that were going to be impacted by a particular decision and just be around so that we could learn together and practice together and, you know, go take deep dives into dry materials, um,
Hmm.
and just take time to unpack that together. And it's COVID is definitely a challenge, to not be able to be together in person. And as we've talked about previously, that I think that uh, government and other groups have been able to hide behind COVID. Um,
Mm,
just all kinds
right.
of, not necessarily emergency proclamations, but like suspension of this law and that law, and um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
so in some ways it's more accessible because you can, like, everything is being live streamed somewhere and you can get on. But
Mm.
in other ways, I think it's become harder to track some of these conversations. But and aside from that, sorry, just zooming out from that a little bit, it's just been hard to not be together in terms of like renewing our spirits and like our relationships, just keeping the relationship strong.
Right.
Just all of a sudden, everybody's, having to reconsider the way they interact and like the way they calculate risk. And
Yeah.
it's hard because it's not just like oh, we can agree to disagree on like our health practices. Like now, it's like it's just kind of blown up into a like, wow, you're gonna do that? That's super irresponsible. Like you're putting other people's lives at risk. Like,
Right.
so it's just a lot of hard conversation, I think. And everybody had their own kind of well-oiled machine going in terms of like childcare, elder care, like their job,
Mm,
school, and all of a sudden, like for each individual household, that's broken. And I think people's capacity to like lend a hand to each other has become, everybody's capacity is like a little bit sapped, I think. And
hmm.
so it's just, yeah, it's a rough time. Yeah.
I will say one thing about the Lahui Hawaii, that I've just been so overwhelmingly heartened by in this time of coronavirus and sort of the physical um, difficulties and risk of being with one another intimately, is the way that over social media, the Lahui has taken those public and publicized uh, governmental responses and mandates about public health and funding from the federal government. And I'm thinking about the way the state of Hawaii is, you know, attempting to promulgate um, good response to keep the people of Hawaii, its citizens, quote unquote, safe. But the Lahui Hawaii over social media has been amazing at just giving it to these elected public officials, whether it's the governor, David Ige, or the lieutenant governor, uh, Josh Green. And so shout out to hashtag Kanaka Twitter. If anybody hasn't checked out Kanaka Twitter on the platform known as Twitter, I highly recommend it. Just type in Twitter's search hashtag Kanaka Twitter. You'll find some astute and sharp criticisms from Hawaiian professors and practitioners, but also younger Kanaka students folks in high school who are calling out the public officials of the settler state of Hawaii for their inadequacies, for their inabilities, and for their fuckery. So shout out to Kanaka Twitter.
I mean, it's an odd, and I mean, I don't want to be too glib about it because people's lives, people are struggling right now. But I do think that there is value in pulling back that curtain for you know sectors of Hawaii that live pretty comfortably to see the ineptness of the quote unquote like governmental leadership, that Kanaka have been calling out for forever, and being dismissed. I do think that, I mean, I would say the same of like the missile alert like error and the whatever,
Yeah.
all those things for people to just be like, whoa, like what is going on? But I think in the current era, particularly like their initiatives around like let's fly other people here to work from home from Hawaii, or like the way that they've mishandled CARES Act money, or just like their obvious priority for tourism over like the health and well-being of the people in Hawaii, like all of those things. I just feel like it's been helpful in a way to make our case for us that they don't really care about you, really care about the economy first and their own position of power. Um, so that's a highlight, low light, um, of COVID.
And I'm super fascinated and don't want to, again, sort of fetishize or romanticize this, as it can be misread. But, the technological, and in specific, social media savvy of the Lahui Hawaii, even before COVID, was on full display in the summer of 2019 when the state was attempting to finally begin construction of the 30-meter telescope project in that summer of 2019, which now seems like so long ago, but really it was not.
Just one COVID
And
year ago.
yeah, one COVID year ago. Hashtag one COVID year. That year is gonna be like maybe 2-3 years, depending on if you have access to the vaccine
Yeah,
or
right. Ugh.
how that works out. But just one COVID year ago, the way in which the Lahui at the base of Maunakea to stop the 30-meter telescope being initially built and developed in this phase of the opposition to it, right, relied, as it has in the past, on its savvy for social media. And so what happened after folks entered into ceremony to create the pu'uhonua at Pu'uhuluhulu across the road from the entrance of Maunakea Access Road, which is the only paved road that construction crews could ascend to the northern plateau where the TMT is currently sited to be built. There was such a robust social media presence that then over time, in those first few weeks we were there were things like Kanaka Uber, where if you needed a ride from the Hilo airport or the Kona airport to the Pu'uhonua at Pu'uhuluhulu, you could get picked up. Actually, somebody that was staying with me and my hui, Kalei, shout out Kalei if you're listening, he was one of the first to get a Kanaka Uber. And he shacked up with us at our camp. And we were like, oh, how's this guy? He just took a flight, got a ride. He's here. And from there, Kanaka Uber just propagated. And there were all these other sorts of like social media campaigns that were launched over Twitter or Instagram. There was one that was called Kanaka Tinder, and I don't think we'll go there in this episode, maybe another episode, and so it was such a robust kind of like flourishing that wasn't against technology, right? but was using technology and social media with such savviness. And typically, we're painted as anti-science and anti-astronomy and observatories when we know that that's not true, but that has been a manufactured bifurcation that relies on us being seen as backwards anachronistic heathens to like modern astronomers and scientists.
Gross.
And it pisses me off. But to come back to one Corona year ago, I love it. One Corona year ago, we saw each other on, I want to say the day after the 15th. I think it was July 16th because I got to Hilo late on the 15th, and my dear Ho'opili Aina Akamu, who was my former debate coach at Kamehameha Schools, picked me up from the Hilo airport because he had been at Maunakea all day, and then we drove right back up and we set up shop. But I think it was the day after, in the morning time, after like 6 a.m. protocol, we had like a 7 a.m. meeting, and we saw each other, and we both just started to tear up. What, do you remember that? What was that like? To like reconnect that way, because we hadn't seen each other for a while and we didn't even talk before that. And then also, what was it like for you to go to Mauna Kea in general?
Okay, dude, it's so funny. We were talking about like one COVID year. That was like one Pu'uhulu Hulu day. Like between the 15th and the 16th. Like, I mean, time got really funky that first week. But yeah, no, I remember seeing you and feeling so emotional and like being surprised at my own emotion. But I think, part of it is just being up there and like the hypervigilance of that kind of situation. And, like, I mean, whatever, it's like day one. It wasn't to be like, oh, we're so afraid on day one. That would be a wrong size statement. But, just the adrenaline of the time, and after the first day of everything that happened. And then I think also it was something about just the unexpectedness of seeing you there, and just a familiar face. Like, it was both inspiring to see so many people who I didn't know, but also it was a little bit overwhelming for me to be around so many people who I didn't know. And yeah, it was amazing to see you through the crowd. And yeah. In terms of what it was like to go there, I mean, I've been able to go to Mauna Kea a few times in the past decade in relation to this work. And the only other time I was there in an era when there was this kind of political action and when there were so many people there at once was in 2015. The last kind of big interaction with law enforcement, which is the time in June. And both times I'll say it's a little bit, for me, it's a little bit, what is the word I want to use here? Kind of out of sync in ways. Like, so, we identify this space as Wawakua, or a place for gods and natural elements to kind of do their thing. And so I actually find it very difficult to interact with other people in that space. When I've got to go in the past, the quietness is like really important, is part of that experience. The ability to have like space to sit and observe, and to not bring in all the like troubles and politics and fear and all those things, was really important. And Kealoha Peshora, who was the one who first took me up there, she like made a real purposeful conversation about preparing yourself to go. and to not bring those things there. So it was a challenge. And of course, Pu'uhuluhulu is a different space than kind of that mid-level where they had the encampment last time at Halepoaku, which is also very different from the actual summit area.
Right.
But yeah, that really was my experience where I felt a little bit out of sorts when I'm there because it's like I'm being pulled in these two different directions of like how I want to be and what I need to focus on and those kinds of things.
I found myself similarly, and so I'm really interested in this that you're bringing up in this moment about like how you enter that space, not at the summit of Maunakea, not at Halepohaku, the visitor center, but at the base, right? Which is, I think, in the beginning stage, some people were confused a COVID year ago where we were, but we were at the base of Maunakea, which is about 6,000 feet in elevation, not at Halepohaku, which is like about 9,000 feet, right?
Mm-hmm. And I think the summit is about 13, between 13 and 14,000.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And like those different atmospheric levels, as you're saying, mean something for us and for all Hawaii,
Mm-hmm.
not just us as Kanaka, but everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you believe that it is, that there are these different vau or realms, and that there is a vau akua, a realm where our deities reside. But at 6,000 feet, I still found it hard to come into and um, be surrounded, which I think goes against this idea that like you show up to a, a resistance camp or a blockade or a pu'uhonu or whatever you want to call it, and things are just like, hunky dory, like we're singing Kumbaya or some shit. you know, we're a lahui. We're complicated. We're diverse. We're not homogenous and monolithic in the same. And when we show up, and we feel in our na'au, in our minds, in our bodies that we need to be there and to stand up for Mauna Kea, for the Akua, for each other, for Hawaii, even for non-Kanaka Maoli, it's difficult and it's complicated. And so I remember feeling that and trying to think about how I was coming into this space, not as somebody who had helped organize the Pu'uhonua necessarily, but as a Hawaiian that wanted to labor and participate in this, So I hear you on that. And I think that there's something to be said about how the Pu'uhonua at Pu'uhuluhulu, while beautiful and forceful and amazing for what it did to support the stand, was a complicated space for us to relearn what it's like to relate to each other and to also still find ourselves in relations that weren't pono.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're still working through that, right? And so I guess like now that we're one COVID year uh in the contemporary time, what is it like for you to like have gone to Mauna Kea to make that stand, but also you've done so much other work with Kahea and outside of Kahea to um, halt the 30-meter telescope at Mauna Kea, but lots of other projects, but specifically thinking about coming down from the Pu'uhonua and Mauna Kea a year and a half ago. What's that process been like? Like, debriefing and trying to work through that stand.
Yeah, I mean, when I went up there ahead of last July or whatever, like it was really important to me to offer ho'okupu and to say pule and set intention at the when I first got there, because I didn't really know what was gonna play out over the next, however long. And I'm really glad I did that. And that was before they were doing, thrice daily protocol, and where it was like very visible and performative, not in a bad way. Um,
Mm-hmm.
uh, I'm really grateful that I had like a little bit of private time to do that ahead of it. And after that first week, I didn't spend a lot of time at the puhonua. I, came back to Oahu, and there was a lot of other work that needed to be done. But I mean, I think it was, it was an opportunity for people to, I don't know, I'm still trying to make sense
Yeah.
of what happened there, but I always kind of joke with folks that like in the earlier years, man, I had some like other visions of how it might go down when the heavy machinery started rolling through. It definitely was not was not with hundreds and at times thousands of people there. So it was so incredible, and it's so incredible to be proved wrong.
Mm-hmm.
um, but it's like also in that space for all people who are trying to deal with historical trauma. People are coming with their own coping, good
Mm-hmm.
and bad, and with their own healing journeys. And so it's exciting just to see all the different possibility, but of course it's like it's really difficult and complicated also. So
Yeah.
and I think um it's like if I were to describe that experience, I think it was like it's very dense,
Mm.
like so many things happened, so rich, so much. It was just like a lot at once, and so I think we're still trying to suss out what all happened and reflect and things like that. So yeah, it's been a lot, and if I'm being honest, it's like all of a sudden we went from pretty small hui, and then probably in 2015, like that kind of ballooned out a bit,
Mm-hmm.
and then 2019 it ballooned even further, um,
Yeah.
which is exciting, and it's like what you want and hope. When you're organizing or trying to build a movement, you want numbers, you want things to get um, big. That's why you're doing it. But
Yeah.
things change. I mean, because of that, and um, I think it's a genuine inquiry in terms of um, how do we change
Mm.
as that larger movement changes. So not a lot of answers there, but
No, I think that's really powerful. Even what we're doing here, and hopefully for our listeners, hopefully there are some kia'i that have found their way to this podcast and are tuning into us still. Um, I really appreciate this space that you're setting and that we're co-creating, because it's important for us to process how not just we went there and we've been there in all these moments in time, but how we come down and how we exit and leave, and the way we still balance our relationship with that place and with others after we've gone. And in a time of COVID, especially, I always return to something that Noelani Goodyer Opua said during a panel that I was on with her and a few other folks, hosted by the Maunakea Syllabus Project. And Noelani said something to the effect of, and I'm paraphrasing, that there needs to be more space for Kanaka and Kia'i to work through that density
mm-hmm.
that you're describing. And I think that,
That's no, I'm sorry. I was just laughing because I, I hadn't thought about it previously. Like one of the but until the panel a couple weeks ago, the Indian panel I was on. But like thinking about
right.
Akea's spaciousness, And I describe, I talk about that in terms of like the sky and, the openness of the physical space of Maunakea. But then it's like, as you're talking right now, what Noelani was saying about the need for more space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, yeah. And you know, not only is there that need for us to kind of continue to balance the spaces between us, I suppose, during coronavirus and sort of, not everybody has come down from Mauna Kea. Um, and so what is it like to support those folks? What is it like to support folks and be in balanced relationships with other folks that are doing legal activism and behind the scenes work, like you're saying, like this Indian collective panel that you were all on, sponsored by Indian Collective, a beautiful panel. If you haven't seen it, check it out. I believe you can access it on their social media platforms, but also the social media platform for Huli, uh, which is now the acronym has changed, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, has it?
What is the current, or from like before? What does Huli stand for again?
Ooh,
Hawaiian Unity
Unity and
and
Liberation
Liberation Institute. Yes,
Institute. Yeah. It has it
it
changed?
was the acronym was different before,
I
and
didn't
now
know.
it's the Hawaiian Unity and Liberation Institute, I believe. I'm pretty sure, but they on their social media platforms also have the panel that Shelley was on. So check it out if you haven't seen it. But we're doing all this work, right? And the corporation is doing a lot of work too
Mm-hmm.
behind the scenes during COVID over Zoom, in emails and chats, and those are not public always.
Mm-hmm.
There are some public meetings like the Board of Regents for the University of California, which is invested in the project, has had public meetings where people have testified and given comments. Those are sort of public things. The Canadian astronomical community here in the settler state of Canada has sort of like documents that they publish, and but there's a lot that they're doing behind the scenes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess, like, to round out our conversation, what are, in your view, are some of the things that are happening right now with the 30-meter telescope, even given that this is a time of COVID and one COVID year from the 2019 stand in the summer of 2019. What is the, like, in your view, sort of current status of the project? It's obviously, it hasn't been built. The building hasn't started because of the stand and the accumulation of opposition. But where are we at right now from your perspective with TMT?
Yeah, I think COVID has brought some has brought a much needed pause. I think not only to this particular project, but just like the nature of global capitalism, and has really brought things to a halt in a way that seemed like impossible to imagine previously. So I think all kinds of new possibilities open because people have needed to contend with like, whoa, what if, um,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and so in that sense that I think I felt hopeful at the beginning of COVID, and I
Mm-hmm.
think that there's an opportunity and an argument to be made for like if ever there was a reminder to like reprioritize your people, the land
Mm-hmm.
that you depend on, that you're like immediately in relation with, because maybe like things are not moving around the world, and
Right.
investing like locally. I'm not talking about money, I'm talking about like energy, time, care, priority. Then this is it. What a lesson that we've all been afforded. I think that the counter narrative that we have to look out for and actively argue against is going to be a timeless one that we're always up against, which is like job creation, economic
Mm,
stimulus, and that's long been an argument, quote unquote, for TMT, is this like
right.
for economic whatever. And so I think that people that are of that view are probably going to double down
Mm,
on that need. Um,
hmm.
but it's interesting because TMT is internationally funded, that you then begin to contend with the international or the domestic politics of each of these different um,
Hmm.
countries, or in the case of the UC schools, almost like its own little country. Um, the politics and economics of each of those places. And so when you just have like a shock to the system like COVID has been, um, unexpected and new things happen. So um, I do think, you know, it should be harder to justify spending, literally billions of dollars on a
Hmm.
telescope in this particular moment. But we'll see. I think that there are other people, technocrats, that would say more than ever before we need to explore, new planets and new places, because,
Mm,
you know, look at the vulnerable situation we're in here on Earth, and we
hmm.
need to colonize somewhere else. Um, so yeah.
What a ridiculous
Oh yeah.
logic, right? Like, let's look for another planet to settle as humans because we've fucked this planet up so much. So peace, y'all. We're we're not even going to be able to form a human settlement on another planet before this planet is destroyed. And in some ways, these observatories do contribute to that, right?
Yeah, I mean, it is a ridiculous notion. It's one I've heard. And it's, to me, it's another one of those, like, you think you're making your argument, but you're really making my argument for me,
Yeah.
in terms of like, wow, we're really not gonna work on kind of human relation or the relationship of people to Aina, and yet you imagine that you're going to go somewhere else and something different is going to happen, like a different outcome is going to happen. It's like, probably now is the time, we are the people that need to like problem solve this between us, together. Um
Yeah.
but I don't know, somehow that logical pitfall is overlooked.
Mahalo again, Shelley. Is there any last words you want to say about perhaps maybe like where people can get more information about TNT Maunakea stuff, or even Kahea, a place where folks can perhaps donate money if they would like to? Any information like that that you want to share with the listeners?
Yeah, we do social media, mostly Facebook. Every once in a while, when we get our act together, we do some Instagram stuff. We have our website, kahea.org. Um, but yeah, I would say probably the most updated stuff maybe would be on Facebook. But yeah, other than that, thank you so much for the invitation. I hope it was all you hoped and dreamed of.
It was, and more.